of our talks about the poetry of faith and doubt from St Saviour's Lent 2022. Today we're going to be talking about Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach. Now, Matthew Arnold was a very important writer in the 19th century, and Dover Beach is possibly one of the most famous poems in the language, certainly from the 19th century. It's up there with Wordsworth's Daffodils and The Charge of the Light Brigade, though of course it is a very different poem from those two. Arnold himself was an important part of Victorian public discourse. He wrote a great deal about culture and poetry and their place in society. And many of the things and ideas he came up with have become part of the currency of modern intellectual thought in the West, so much so that we rather take him for granted. And Dover Beach, of course, is his most famous poem. It's quite a odd poem in some ways because it falls into four parts, as you will see when I read it. The fourth part was probably written first when he was on his honeymoon, and about 1846 possibly, but later. But the whole poem was put together, they think, in 1851, and the first three parts of the four-part poem were written later. And this may account for the fact that the fourth verse, or they're not really verses as such, but the fourth portion of the poem is different in imagery and, in fact, in tone from the rest of it. It doesn't really detract from its power as a poem, but when you're analysing it, you are slightly taken aback by the fact that the fourth verse seems to come from a different space emotionally and in terms of its imagery from the rest of it. But nonetheless, it does still pack its punch even to this day. And there are many people who regard it as, if not the finest poem in the language, at least their favourite poem in the language, which says something about perhaps the nature of our society. But I shall read it to you, and then I will talk about Arnold a little bit and some of his ideas very briefly, and then I will give you a resume of our parish group discussion about it, which I thought was very enlightening and inspiring. So here we go. Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, 1851, published in 1867. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles, which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin with tremulance cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles, long ago, heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Our love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. So as you can see, the poem falls into four parts. It starts with the poet and his new wife, his beloved, standing at their apartment at a hotel by the beach, looking out the window, hearing the tide go out, looking at the night sky, and hearing the waves crash upon the beach, stones of the beach. Beautiful, evocative lovely scene. And that reminds him of Sophocles, which a good educated Victorian possibly would have done, and Sophocles' reflections on the tide and flow in the affairs of men. And this brings another thought to his mind, that of the Sea of Faith, which the Sea of Faith, medieval Christianity to a large extent, but also, of course, going well into the 19th century, where it seemed to be at its flood and unstoppable, really. But in Arnold's view, of course, it is on its way out. And it's got the all he can hear is the melancholy, long, withdrawing roar of faith. And then in the fourth verse, he clings to his beloved as he feels himself completely surrounded by uncertainties and evil and ignorance, and that there is nothing any more to cling on to because religion has gone, the tide has gone out. So Arnold struggled all his life with faith and doubt because he was enormously emotionally, almost intellectually drawn to the idea of religion, particularly of Christianity, and Newman was his mentor, and he looked up to Newman, the great saint and Christian, enormously, but of course couldn't believe and agree with what Newman stood for. So he was conflicted all his life, and he felt that there must be something else to put in the place of what Christianity had been. He had to think of a way of compensating for the withdrawing of the Sea of Faith, and he struggled to find substitutes intellectually and emotionally. He wrote, for example, in the study of poetry, one of his most famous writings, he wrote, "Without poetry, our science will appear incomplete, and most of what now passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry." So at that point he was struggling with the idea that poetry might fill the space that religion once had, that human beings needed something desperately, and perhaps poetry was to be the thing. But clearly that didn't really work for him. He said, later on, he wrote, "To pass from a Christianity relying on its miracles to a Christianity relying on its natural truth is a great change. It can only be brought about by those whose attachment to Christianity is such that they cannot part with it and yet cannot but deal with it sincerely." So he's talking about people like himself there, I think, people who cannot part with it but cannot but deal with it sincerely. So he's struggling. He didn't, I think, come up with any satisfactory answer to his own question. And that's one of the reasons, I suppose, why the poem speaks to us so powerfully, because even from 1851 to this day, we have been struggling intellectually with how do we deal with the retreat of the Sea of Faith, and what do we replace our ancient Christianity, if we indeed feel the necessity to replace it. What do we replace it with if we want to have a modern faith that speaks to modern man? Now, many people would say there is no need to replace it with anything, that there was no flaw whatsoever in what we had handed down to us, and that's a perfectly defensible position. But for those who do doubt, then we have, perhaps as committed Christians, we have to have an answer. So I put the question to the group last night at St Saviour's. If Matthew Arnold was sitting in this room with us now, what would we say to him? How would we address his problems, his difficulties, his doubts? And what our group came up with was really rather beautiful, very inspiring evening, I have to say. And I've capsulated it down into three statements, really. One was that faith is not understanding but trust, because we can't possibly understand everything, and so we take on trust what we are taught and what we have learnt to believe, and that is the basis of our faith. So we are creatures of faith, we faithful Christians, the definitions in the phrase. And secondly, and this is very, very important, I think, that hope is the key to our faith. Hope is the key. We do not know, but we hope for grace, and we hope for goodness, and we hope that God as the source of grace and goodness underpins the universe. And we hope also, we might add, as I'm sure Arnold himself would, that love is all. Love is the centre. God is love and love is God, as we know from our scriptures. But Arnold himself already knew that. And then the second question I posed to the group was that one of the things that's implicit in the poem, but not often recognised, is that if a tide goes out, a tide comes back in. So we can assume, even in this rather drear and sad poem, that in fact the tide will come back in, and that one day there will be another church or another form of Christianity flooding the world. And what I asked them, would that look like? And it seems to me that the church, and this seemed to be to the group as well, that the church would be very different in the future. It clearly must be when the tide comes back in. But although the sacred spaces will still be vitally important to us, everybody needs to find their own path, and it will be much more individualistic, and it will be much more inclusive. And as a community, the church will need to counter all the negatives that Arnold talks about in the last verse, the world that has no certitude nor peace nor help for pain, that in fact it will be our role as a church, as a loving community, to give people some sense of certitude and love and joy and light. And this is one of the things that the new church will do, and that we will in the new church accept that sadness is part of the human condition and have no difficulty with that, and that we will focus on love, not doctrine, love for all, everybody, not just those who are inside the club, as it were. So these were the thoughts of our little group as we met last night and talked about Arnold's Dover Beach. So I commend this beautiful poem to you, and I think reading it with prayerfulness and with joy and hope in your heart, that you will find something of God in the beauty of the poetry. Thank you.